Imagine living next door to someone who appears completely ordinary, a polite, quiet, and professional individual who blends seamlessly into a busy London neighborhood. To neighbors, he is unremarkable. To colleagues, he is reliable and trustworthy. Yet beneath this calm, everyday exterior lies a hidden life that stretches across continents, a life so carefully constructed that it masks the operations of a multi-million-pound criminal network. This is the story of how appearances can deceive, and how the unassuming can sometimes hold extraordinary power behind closed doors. Himo Vaid's life in Cheam, South London, looked like the perfect example of a successful, middle-aged businessman. He ran a modest import-export company, communicated politely with staff, and maintained a lifestyle that raised no suspicion. From the outside, everything seemed normal. There were no signs of the global criminal network he secretly coordinated. His neighbors described him as courteous, professional, and completely unremarkable. He didn't draw attention, didn't flaunt wealth, and rarely spoke of his personal affairs. It was the perfect cover, and it worked because people simply saw what they wanted to see: an ordinary man building a legitimate business in a city full of entrepreneurs. Yet behind the doors of his home and behind encrypted digital communications, Vaid was anything but ordinary. Using the alias Startcake, he became the logistics mastermind for one of the most sophisticated trafficking networks operating across the UK and Europe. He orchestrated major bulk shipments of illegal goods, moving Brazilian loads and Dutch deliveries worth millions. Unlike many criminals who rely on intimidation or violence, his method was entirely methodical, entirely businesslike. He didn't need to threaten anyone because he controlled the process itself, managing supply chains, coordinating timing, and ensuring smooth operations across borders. Every step was calculated, every detail carefully executed, and every transaction designed to remain invisible to law enforcement. The brilliance of his cover lay in its simplicity. By presenting himself as a legitimate import-exporter, Vaid had access to the infrastructure he needed: warehouses, shipping companies, freight services, and banking facilities. The same systems that move legitimate goods around the world were used for illegal purposes. And because he looked like a normal businessman, there was little reason for anyone to question him. No one suspected that the polite man who exchanged emails and attended routine meetings was orchestrating a logistics empire valued at more than £4 million. He understood the power of appearances and exploited them fully, ensuring that every public interaction reinforced his cover. At the heart of his operations was technology. EncroChat, an encrypted messaging platform, provided the digital safety net he believed made him untouchable. Through this platform, he communicated with suppliers, distributors, and partners in a way that seemed secure. Messages were carefully coded, instructions precise, and every operation meticulously planned. Vaid's use of encryption was a reflection of his understanding of modern criminal enterprise. In the 21st century, logistics and communication are as critical as any physical presence. He was not just hiding behind walls, he was hiding behind sophisticated systems that, until 2020, made him feel untouchable. What makes his story particularly compelling is how normal everything appeared. There were no dramatic gestures, no public displays of wealth, and no overt signs of criminal activity. To the casual observer, Vaid was a model citizen, attentive to his business, careful with his finances, and polite to anyone he encountered. Yet every digital message, every travel receipt, and every banking transaction carefully concealed a far more complex reality. He was a man living two lives simultaneously, one in the visible world of business and society, and another hidden world of international crime. Both operated at the same time, both meticulously managed, and both dependent on the illusion that they were separate. Neighbors, colleagues, and even law enforcement initially had no reason to suspect anything unusual. He appeared committed to legitimate work and maintained a routine that mirrored thousands of law-abiding entrepreneurs in the UK. By avoiding the trappings commonly associated with criminal activity, luxury cars, flashy lifestyles, and public attention, he reduced the risk of exposure. His quiet demeanor and careful planning created an almost perfect shield, allowing him to coordinate multi-million-pound shipments without drawing notice. The story shows that in modern organized crime, subtlety and intelligence can be far more effective than aggression or intimidation. The duality of his life underscores a critical point. Crime in the modern era often mirrors legitimate business practices. Vaid's operations were structured, professional, and efficient. He understood global supply chains, financial transactions, and risk management, not because he studied them in school, but because survival in criminal enterprise requires mastery of these systems. To the outside world, he was running a thriving import-export business. To the criminal network, he was the linchpin ensuring that operations flowed smoothly across countries and continents. The sophistication of his methods highlights how organized crime has evolved, becoming less about physical dominance and more about intellectual control. Despite the meticulous planning, the greatest vulnerability in Vaid's operations was not human error or violence. It was technology. He relied heavily on encrypted communications to remain invisible. Every instruction, every transaction, every shipment plan was transmitted digitally, and he trusted that encryption made him safe. This confidence in technology was both his strength and his weakness. It shielded him for years, allowing him to operate on a scale few could imagine. But it also created a single point of failure. If the system were compromised, the digital trail would be undeniable. Ultimately, what makes his story so gripping is the contrast between his ordinary exterior and extraordinary hidden life. It is a cautionary tale about appearances, trust, and the sophistication of modern crime. One moment he is the polite businessman from South London who greets neighbors with a smile. The next, he is the mastermind behind multi-million-pound trafficking operations coordinated across continents. That contrast, the ordinary versus the extraordinary, captures the essence of modern organized crime and shows how easy it is for danger to hide behind a mask of normality. It reminds us that, in a world driven by technology and global commerce, the most powerful operators may be the ones you least suspect.
And the sophistication of Himal Vaid's operations becomes even clearer when you consider how entirely he avoided the methods most people associate with organized crime. There were no street-level enforcers, no violent intimidation, no dramatic showdowns. His power lay in planning, precision, and control of the flow of information and goods. Vaid understood that in modern crime, the greatest leverage comes from logistics, technology, and trust. Every shipment, every message, and every financial transaction was part of a carefully choreographed system designed to ensure success without drawing attention. Unlike the overt aggression that often defines criminal networks in popular imagination, his method relied on appearing perfectly legitimate while manipulating the infrastructure around him to achieve illicit goals. Himal Vaid's use of encryption illustrates just how modern organized crime has adapted to the digital age. EncroChat, a platform designed for secure messaging, allowed him to communicate with suppliers, distributors, and associates without fear of interception, or so he thought. Through this encrypted environment, he could issue instructions, coordinate shipments, and manage payments in a way that mimicked legitimate business operations. He used codes, aliases, and careful language to ensure that even if messages were intercepted, their true meaning would remain opaque. To the casual observer, it might have appeared that he was simply running a busy import-export business, sending routine communications across Europe. Yet each message carried critical instructions for the movement of millions in goods with precise timing, ensuring that the network operated like a well-oiled machine. What made this approach particularly effective was its invisibility. They didn't need to threaten anyone or rely on brute force. The system itself ensured compliance. Suppliers followed instructions because the operation was efficient, reliable, and profitable. Distributors in the UK depended on the precision of his scheduling to maintain their own operations. Each step of the network reinforced the others, creating a cycle in which reliability was both the carrot and the stick. Trust became the invisible currency that allowed the network to function, and Vade's careful orchestration ensured that this trust remained unbroken until the moment technology itself intervened. It is important to understand that Vade's strategy was not simply about secrecy, it was about professionalism. He understood the principles of global trade, shipping logistics, and international finance in a way that mirrored legitimate business practices. He coordinated shipments from Brazil to Europe and then into the UK, aligning shipping schedules, customs clearance, and financial settlements with precision. Every decision reflected a deep understanding of how legitimate trade works, and he exploited these systems to serve illicit purposes. By doing so, he blurred the line between lawful commerce and criminal activity, creating a world where the mechanisms of legality were used to conceal illegality. One of the key elements of his operation was the management of money. While most people imagine criminal profits being stored in cash or hidden under floorboards, Vade relied on modern financial techniques that mirrored corporate practices. He used a combination of Hawala-style informal banking networks and digital currency channels to move money efficiently, minimizing the risk of detection. Each transaction was carefully planned to avoid raising suspicion while maintaining liquidity for future shipments. He understood that moving goods without corresponding financial discipline could expose the operation, and so he treated every payment as carefully as he treated every shipment. In this sense, his criminal enterprise was not chaotic, it was meticulously structured, resembling a multinational corporation with a single highly competent executive at the helm. The Dutch and Brazilian connections illustrate the reach and complexity of his operations. Brazilian suppliers provided raw materials or products that had high street value in Europe, while weekly deliveries from the Netherlands allowed the UK network to maintain a steady flow of goods. Vade's role as the logistics coordinator was essential. He ensured that these shipments were timed perfectly, customs documentation appeared legitimate, and delivery points were coordinated for maximum efficiency. A single misstep could disrupt the entire operation, yet the network ran smoothly for years under his supervision. The precision required demonstrates not only criminal cunning, but a level of operational intelligence rarely acknowledged outside investigative reports and court documents. What makes this aspect of Vade's story particularly striking is that he accomplished all of this without drawing attention to himself. Many people involved in large-scale criminal networks eventually attract scrutiny simply through the scale of their operations. But Vade's ordinary lifestyle, polite demeanor, and businesslike conduct allowed him to remain unnoticed. He attended professional meetings, ran a visible but unremarkable company, and interacted with colleagues and neighbors in a manner that never aroused suspicion. The contrast between his public persona and private activities was stark, and this duality allowed him to operate effectively for years. Even within his network, Vade's method of control emphasized coordination over coercion. Associates were motivated by efficiency and profit, not fear. Clear communication, reliable scheduling, and consistent financial settlements ensured that everyone had a vested interest in maintaining the system he orchestrated. His leadership style relied on demonstrating competence and creating an environment where following instructions was rational and mutually beneficial. In other words, he created an ecosystem in which compliance was incentivized through clarity, professionalism, and trust rather than through threats or intimidation. But as carefully as he constructed his digital fortress, it was ultimately vulnerable to technological intrusion. The reliance on EncroChat, which he trusted implicitly, became his Achilles heel. Until 2020, this platform provided a secure environment where he could communicate freely. But when French law enforcement successfully infiltrated the network, the encryption that had seemed impenetrable became irrelevant. Messages that were intended to remain private for years were captured, revealing months of meticulous coordination. For Vaid, the very technology that enabled his operations had created the evidence that would later dismantle them. The irony is striking. The tools of modern crime, which rely on precision and innovation, also leave trails that can lead investigators directly to the orchestrator.
And once the infiltration of EncroChat occurred, the entire carefully constructed world Himal Vaid had built began to unravel. For years, he had relied on the assumption that encrypted communications could shield him from scrutiny, that the alias Startcake would remain disconnected from his real identity, and that digital traces could be managed to avoid exposure. But the French law enforcement operation changed everything. Suddenly, messages that were once private, detailing months of shipments, financial arrangements, and coordination with suppliers across Brazil, the Netherlands, and the UK, became visible to authorities. The data provided a comprehensive record of his activity, showing not only the scale of the operation, but the exact role Vaid played in maintaining its efficiency. For investigators, this was a treasure trove, a window into a criminal network that had long operated undetected. Investigators immediately began cross-referencing the captured communications with real-world evidence. Dubai travel receipts, previously unremarkable in isolation, suddenly became pieces of a larger puzzle. Vaid had traveled for meetings, consultations, and inspections under the guise of legitimate business. Each receipt, timestamp, and location detail now corresponded with EncroChat messages, demonstrating that these trips were part of a coordinated effort to ensure shipments arrived on schedule and that business partners remained aligned. GPS data, cell phone records, and banking transactions were then layered on top, creating an interconnected map of activity that left little room for ambiguity. Each digital trace reinforced the narrative revealed in the messages, that Vaid was the central figure orchestrating an international logistics network with precision and forethought. One of the most striking elements of the investigation was how mundane some of the evidence appeared at first glance. Receipts for hotel stays, flight bookings, and meals might seem trivial, but when analyzed alongside the encrypted messages, they revealed a pattern of regular international travel that facilitated the movement of millions in goods. Bank transfers that seemed ordinary within the context of a legitimate import-export business took on new significance when linked to transactions referenced in the captured chats. Every detail mattered because it built a comprehensive timeline, demonstrating not only intent, but sustained activity over months and years. What had been invisible through conventional observation became undeniable when multiple sources were connected. The investigators' approach emphasized meticulous analysis rather than dramatic confrontations. Each message, receipt, and account record was examined in detail, with the goal of constructing a clear, chronological account of operations. Patterns began to emerge: scheduled shipments, repeated interactions with specific European contacts, and a consistent methodology for moving funds using informal banking networks that mimicked legitimate corporate finance. Even the most careful attempts to obfuscate activity left subtle clues in language, timing, and structure. The depth of the investigation revealed that while Vaid had been highly competent, no system is entirely immune to scrutiny, especially when law enforcement has access to both digital and physical evidence. As the investigation progressed, authorities identified the critical junctures that connected Vaid's public persona with his alias and criminal activity. EncroChat provided the bridge between Startcake and Himal Vaid, while supporting evidence from Dubai travel records, GPS tracking, and banking activity confirmed the linkage. Investigators could now pinpoint when shipments were arranged, how funds were moved, and who was involved at each stage of the operation. The clarity provided by these connections transformed suspicion into certainty. It was no longer a case of circumstantial evidence. The data revealed the inner workings of a network that had previously been invisible, showing Vaid's role as the mastermind behind the logistics rather than a peripheral participant. This stage of the investigation also highlighted the sheer sophistication of modern criminal operations. Vaid's approach combined traditional smuggling techniques with digital coordination, blending physical logistics with encrypted messaging and informal financial networks. The use of multiple countries for supply, storage, and distribution created layers of complexity designed to obscure responsibility and delay detection. Investigators needed to follow the money, trace shipments, and verify communications simultaneously, building a multi-layered case that connected dots across continents. The result was a meticulous reconstruction of how a quiet businessman could manage an operation generating millions, all while maintaining an unremarkable daily life in London. The investigation also uncovered the disciplined methods Vaid used to maintain operational security. EncroChat allowed him to control who had access to sensitive information, set strict communication protocols, and manage the timing of instructions with precision. Suppliers and distributors were given just enough information to complete their tasks without knowing the entirety of the network, reducing the risk of accidental exposure. Investigators noted that while these measures delayed detection, they also left a trail of structured evidence, proof of coordination that ultimately became irrefutable. Every layer of security, when combined with the compromised encryption, contributed to a clear picture of responsibility. By the time the authorities were ready to move, the case against Vaid was overwhelming. The convergence of digital messages, financial records, travel data, and GPS tracking created a narrative that left little room for doubt. Arrest plans were executed with careful timing to ensure that evidence could be secured and operations would not continue unchecked. The knock on Vaid's door in 2024 was not sudden for those following the investigation. It was the inevitable conclusion of months of patient, detailed work. For Vaid, the world that appeared so secure and controlled collapsed within moments. The alias Starkcake could no longer protect him, and every carefully managed shipment and transaction was now documented as part of the case. The culmination of this phase of the investigation demonstrates how modern law enforcement uses technology, intelligence, and meticulous analysis to dismantle sophisticated criminal networks. The tools Vaid relied on for security, the encrypted messages, the digital coordination, the international logistics, were also the tools that made his exposure possible. By connecting digital footprints to real-world actions, authorities transformed what had seemed like a clandestine, untouchable operation into a transparent and provable case. It is a testament to the evolving nature of both crime and law enforcement. As criminal methods become more sophisticated, investigative strategies must adapt, using precision, patience, and technological insight to reveal the truth. Ultimately, this stage of the story illustrates a key lesson. No matter how meticulous or intelligent a criminal operation appears, it is never completely invisible. Vaid's success relied on the assumption that his methods were beyond detection. But with careful, coordinated investigation, even the most carefully encrypted communications and professionally executed logistics can be traced, analyzed, and linked to their operator. The exposure of Vaid's operations shows that diligence, technology, and attention to detail are often more powerful than any attempt at secrecy. It also emphasizes that the apparent normality of an individual, polite neighbors, legitimate business appearances, cannot obscure the reality revealed through patient investigation.
The arrest of Hemal Vaid in 2024 marked the moment when years of carefully orchestrated operations and meticulous planning collided with the unyielding reality of law enforcement. In the early hours of a quiet morning, officers arrived at his home in Cheam, South London, moving with precision to ensure that evidence could be secured and that the operation he had so carefully managed would not continue unchecked. Vaid, the man who had for years blended seamlessly into his community, was confronted with the truth he had spent over a decade avoiding. The alias Starkcake could no longer protect him, and the digital footprint he had relied upon to coordinate multi-million-pound shipments had become the chain that bound him to justice. For those who had known him only as a polite, unassuming businessman, the sight was jarring. For investigators, it was the culmination of patient, meticulous work that had transformed suspicion into certainty. The subsequent investigation and legal process were methodical, reflecting the gravity and complexity of the case. The evidence compiled from EncroChat, bank records, GPS data, travel receipts, and shipment logs painted a comprehensive picture of a man who had been at the center of a sophisticated international network. Each piece of information, when examined alone, might have seemed inconsequential: an ordinary travel receipt, a routine bank transfer, or a brief encrypted message. But together, these fragments formed an unbroken chain demonstrating intent, coordination, and repeated engagement in criminal activity. Investigators were able to show that Vade had not been a peripheral participant, but the central figure ensuring the network operated seamlessly across continents, from South America to Europe and into the UK. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Vade ultimately chose to plead guilty to 13 serious offenses. The guilty plea was not just a legal formality. It was an acknowledgement of a reality that had been meticulously documented by investigators. By admitting responsibility, he avoided the uncertainty and potential escalation of a protracted trial, but the plea also cemented his accountability in the public record. For the judicial system, the plea allowed the court to focus on the scale, sophistication, and consequences of his actions rather than debate the credibility of evidence. It was a crucial step in the process, highlighting both the effectiveness of the investigation and the undeniable nature of the evidence collected. The courtroom proceedings that followed offered a stark contrast to the quiet life Vade had led in Chim. Rather than the calm, professional demeanor that had allowed him to operate under the radar, the legal process exposed the full extent of his operations. Prosecutors detailed how he had coordinated bulk shipments, managed financial transactions across informal and formal banking networks, and used encryption to communicate instructions with precision. They illustrated how the alias Stark Cake was central to maintaining operational secrecy and how the digital records, combined with real-world evidence, demonstrated both his intent and capacity to execute complex logistical operations. Every document, message, and record presented was a piece of the puzzle, showing that a man who appeared ordinary had in reality been extraordinary in his criminal sophistication. Sentencing reflected the gravity of the offenses. Hemal Vade was handed an 18-year prison term, a sentence that acknowledged not only the financial magnitude of his actions, £4 million worth of controlled goods, but also the level of organization, planning, and manipulation involved. The sentence sent a clear message: in the digital age, no one is untouchable, and sophisticated methods designed to hide criminal activity will ultimately face accountability. The length and severity of the sentence also highlighted the responsibility that comes with access to technology and knowledge of global systems. Using such expertise to orchestrate criminal operations carries significant consequences. Beyond the individual consequences for Vade, the case had broader implications for law enforcement, policy, and public understanding of organized crime. It demonstrated how modern criminal networks often operate in ways that mirror legitimate business enterprises, with an emphasis on logistics, finance, and digital coordination rather than violence. Investigators, by leveraging digital forensics, traditional records, and international cooperation, were able to penetrate a network that had previously seemed invisible. The case serves as a precedent for understanding how criminal sophistication and legitimate infrastructure can intersect, providing insight into how law enforcement must adapt in an increasingly interconnected and technologically dependent world. The story also underscores the human dimension of organized crime. Vade had cultivated trust, projected competence, and maintained a professional demeanor not only to the outside world, but to those within his network. Suppliers, distributors, and colleagues had no reason to doubt his legitimacy because his operations appeared structured, reliable, and professional. This careful cultivation of trust, combined with the strategic use of technology and logistical systems, illustrates the subtlety and intelligence required to operate a large-scale network without detection. At the same time, it shows the ethical and legal boundaries that were crossed and the devastating consequences that follow when expertise is applied to criminal purposes. The ripple effects of Vade's exposure reached far beyond the courtroom. Associates within the network faced scrutiny. Law enforcement gained valuable insight into operational methods, and the public was reminded that criminal activity often thrives under the guise of normalcy. The case challenged assumptions about what criminal networks look like,
emphasizing that sophistication and subtlety can make them more dangerous and harder to detect than overtly violent organizations. Furthermore, the investigation highlighted the power of international collaboration, from French authorities infiltrating EncroChat to UK law enforcement coordinating the arrest and evidence collection. The case exemplified how cross-border cooperation is essential in an era where crime transcends national boundaries. For the community in Cheam, the revelation was shocking. The man who had appeared as an ordinary, polite, and professional neighbor was revealed to be orchestrating a complex international operation. It was a moment that forced reflection on the limits of perception and the challenges of identifying criminal activity in environments where appearances are carefully managed. The contrast between Vade's public persona and private actions emphasized the importance of critical observation, oversight, and vigilance even in seemingly ordinary settings. The final lesson of this story is multifaceted. It highlights the evolution of organized crime, where intelligence, technology, and logistics often outweigh brute force. It underscores the inevitability of accountability, even for those who believe themselves invisible behind encryption and legitimate business facades. And it demonstrates the importance of diligence, patience, and cross-disciplinary collaboration in law enforcement, showing that modern criminal networks, no matter how sophisticated, are ultimately vulnerable to thorough investigation and evidence-based prosecution. In the end, Himmelvade's story is a cautionary tale for both society and those tempted to misuse knowledge and expertise. It illustrates how ambition, intelligence, and access to sophisticated tools can be redirected toward destructive purposes, and how the consequences of those choices are inescapable once exposed. His case reminds us that while appearances can deceive, truth, methodical investigation, and the convergence of technology and law enforcement will eventually reveal the reality hidden beneath even the most ordinary exterior. It is a story of deception, ingenuity, and justice, one that reflects both the capabilities and vulnerabilities of modern organized crime.